Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Welsh Republic Podcast, episode 149 today. And I am here with my guest, Jason Smith. He's the host of the Bridge podcast. Hey, Jason, how are you doing today? Is everything all good with you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on.
What have you been up to today, Jason? And how is everything going on with there, where you're in China at the moment? How's the weather doing?
That's a great question. Can I answer that in a little longer answer than you might expect? One of my
Yeah.
cats is passing away. She has pancreatic cancer, and she's in her death throes. And so last night in the morning, it's 3 p.m. here, about 3 a.m. here. I went to comfort her, but it was apparently a bad idea because she's in so much pain, and she bit me quite brutally. And so I've been at a hospital all morning getting rabies shots. And there's it's very improbable that she has rabies because she's my house cat. But the doctors wanted to address that. And I thought it was really funny because I posted something on TikTok recently. No, Twitter. I posted something on Twitter recently showing like if you go to a bank in China, sometimes it takes like an hour. And if you're a foreigner, there'll be like 3 or 4 people all looking at the computer trying to figure out what to do because your information has to be inputted differently. And I had the same experience at the hospital today. I presented them with my people's insurance card, and they were like, oh, at a special hospital, at a rabies hospital. And they were like all confused about how to input my details into the computer. And there was like a team of 3 or 4 people all looking at the computer, talking to each other, having a conference about it. I thought it was very cute. So it took a little time to get into the hospital, 30 minutes instead of like the usual like 1 minute, because they have these really fast moving queues to get into the hospital. It took me a little bit longer. I felt a little bad because some people who were trying to queue behind me clearly couldn't move, but eventually they sorted it out and I've got all my shots and stuff.
Really sorry to hear that about your cat, man. That sucks. I do remember you were mentioning something to me about that. That's why we had to reschedule a few times. What type of cat is your cat? What type of cat is he?
Oh, I have 3 cats. They're all mutts. None of them is a thoroughbred anything. I just, get kittens from the market kind of thing. Like there's a Huanyao Shichang, which just means flower like, market kind of place, not far from my home. So one of our cats we got there, one we saved. It was a rescue cat who was just like, a feral cat, but it was a kitten from the hutongs, the little alleys in Beijing. And this one was given to us 11 years ago, the one that is passing. By a friend who had a litter and needed to find homes for them.
Mhm. Wow, that's very good. You're doing that. Do you have any dogs?
No, I like dogs, but I live in Beijing and I'm in an apartment, and I don't think personally, unless you're getting a small dog, I don't think I would want a big dog. I can't have a big dog in an apartment. That seems kind of cruel to me. A big dog deserves like room to
Yeah.
run around and play and frolic and stuff. And I really don't think my little apartment in Beijing is suitable to have like a really, nice big dog, like a golden retriever or something. I just couldn't get that in this home.
You know, one really misconception that a lot of Westerners have is that, oh, Chinese people eat dogs. But I lived in Hong Kong for a long time, and I can tell you that Chinese people love dogs. They love dogs as pets. There's so many dogs in Hong Kong and in China. And you get a lot of TikTok videos. I remember a long time ago, there was a YouTube video where this dog owner in Hong Kong, he had a border collie, and he bought a whole swimming pool area for his border collie.
Wow. Wow.
I
In
can't
Hong
believe
Kong,
that.
that must be rich to do that.
Oh, they must have been. It was a very lucky golden retriever, but sorry, border collie, but loved his dog, man. You get a lot
Mm.
of Shiba Inus in China and Hong Kong, which is very impressive, which is very interesting, very cool. So, Jason, tell me about yourself. So, like, tell me, like, how long have you been living in China? Sorry, how long have you been living in China? And
Well,
what was your journey to China from the United States? And tell me, what made you get into politics and start your own show and going onto Twitter and stuff? So tell me your background and all that.
mm,
What led you into the world of politics? And how long you've been living in China? And tell me like your story to China when you moved there and
sure.
stuff, and why you moved
Well,
there.
mm, yeah, sure. Well, I'm originally from California, and typical Californian. I lived in San Francisco for a while, Berkeley for a while, the Central Valley for a while. Overeducated, got a bunch of degrees, And then I was like, okay, what am I supposed to do now? And I didn't really want to hang around. I kind of I'm at a master's degree in history, world history. And I was like, well, I haven't really seen the world except for Canada. So maybe I should go and live abroad. So my first trip, it was in 2010. I moved to South Korea for a year. And, it was nice and stuff, but I didn't feel like, oh, this is home or something. So I went back to San Francisco for a year and then I moved to China. And like most people, I was coming to China for a few years. Most people say, oh, I was coming to China for a year or two. That was what was happening. And then I was just like, I like it here. Because I went from being like kind of lower middle class in the United States to having a teaching job in China. At that time in 2012, that was like upper middle class. So I was like, suddenly, like, I could go out every night and still save money or whatever. It didn't matter. And so I felt, oh, this is a nice transition. I'll just keep staying here for a while and see what happens and what develops. Eventually, that changed, and English teachers are no longer upper middle class. But I actually was not into politics, even though my background in school was studying politics and history and philosophy and stuff. I wasn't really like, I want to get into politics. But I was always talking about it with my friends. And it was actually my wife who was like, wow, you talk about this all the time. Maybe, and people really like you, get in big groups and people surround me and we all have these really deep conversations. Maybe we should do this online. So I just opened a Xigua account, which is kind of a subset of Douyin here in China. And suddenly, just like first video, I think it was 30,000 views. So it's just like, okay, people like what
Wow.
I have to say. Maybe I should do more of that. So I started doing more of that and it grew. And then I just started opening up more and more and more and more vehicles to communicate to see what would happen. And I happened to hit it off really big on TikTok. I have 1.4 million followers. I have 3 YouTube accounts with a total of about 9 or 10,000. In China, I have about 60,000 followers spread out across Bilibili, Douyin, and Xigua, and other platforms. I have a ton of I'm on everything. Whatever exists, I'm on there somewhere. And I do pretty well on Twitter. So I spend more time on Twitter because it's fun for me. I don't know. There's something about that particular vehicle that I enjoy being on. So I spend a lot of time there, at least a couple hours a day. I just make videos. I go to a lot of places in China. I travel around. I'm trying to see every province in China. And so that gives me the opportunity to make a lot of videos. So my wife and I travel. We went to Inner Mongolia, for example. We went to Hohhot. So we made a bunch of videos about going to restaurants there, going to, people speak Mongolian there. And as long as I was doing it, it made a lot of sense to dispel things that are not true about China. So one of the accusations is in Inner Mongolia, in China's Inner Mongolia, that people don't speak Mongolian, that it's being erased, or that there's no Mongolian on signage. So I made a bunch of videos showing that basically every restaurant, every business, banks even have Mongolian writing with Chinese writing on them. I was in a taxi in Hohhot, and they were listening to the radio, and it was clearly not Mandarin Chinese. They were listening to Mongolian speakers. That it was like a Mongolian radio station. So a lot of these accusations that are, lobbed at China clearly are not true. And as an American living in China, I feel kind of now, especially in the last few years, I kind of have a responsibility to share what life in China is actually like. So I read these, people and some media that say these things about China. And then I'm like, when that is not the case, I feel it's incumbent upon me to share that is not the case. Because whatever we think about China, whether it's a hawk or a dove or whatever, at least we should have accurate information about what China is actually like. That is the basic starting point for having a dialogue, right? So that's where I am.
Hmm. When you look at China right now, how does it feel to you to be in a country where a lot of people trust their government, which was done by a survey by Harvard University for a long time, I think for over 20 years, that showed China, the Chinese people trust their government more than any country in the world. How does it feel like we're living in a country where they trust their government, a government that values the people, values its human rights, gives them true freedom, true liberty, a country where you can walk on, like where a woman can walk in the middle of the street and not get shot, like especially with the shit that happens in the United States, whether it's in New York or California. And like, how does it feel like being in a country that, has overcome like poverty, with the poverty alleviation, thing? and especially knowing how China has, the People's Natural Congress, how their political system works for them, and how, the people in China, tell their feelings and the government listens to them and the government doesn't arrest them for, saying their opinions, because that's just Western propaganda for people who say that China is a
Mhm.
dictatorship when it's not, it's actually a democracy. How does that feel to you, living in a country that values its people, values, human rights, knowing it has the most trusted government in the world of any country in the world? Compare that to the United States, where the United States is just a constitution, it's just a corporation larping as a constitutional republic that claims to be the land of the free, the land of democracy, but yet has the biggest suicidal problem in the world and just problems out of it. How does that feel to you? And it's good.
Well, that's a lot of different questions. So let me try to break it down. So that my answer might be long. Let's just take safety first. Firstly, I don't want to misdescribe China. In 2012, I was learning about scams that took place at that time in China. There was one called the tea scam. So you would, a pretty girl might approach you, or a handsome boy, depending on your
Mm,
gender, right? And then they would ask you to have tea with them. You go into a tea house, and I knew there's someone that this actually happened to after I read about it. And you go into a tea house, and they talk to you, and you're given a menu, and you order tea, and the prices are such that you're like, okay, this is tea. But after you're finished, they give you a bill with a different menu, with a different set of prices, and it's much higher. So is there crime in China? Yeah, but I mean, there's considerably less. This was happening in 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16. This almost does not happen now. Like, the safety over the last 10 years has increased dramatically. In terms of street crime, what street crime? Like, yes, there are people who are very famous. I'm not going to say their names, on Twitter and on YouTube, who like to find, those one or two or three cases every week or two in a population of 1.4 billion. So it's possible where something crazy happens, where like a woman is yielding a knife and the police have to arrest her in a way that prevents her from hurting them. Of course, they never shoot. Cops don't have guns here, firstly. So they usually just capture them and remove the knife. But people throw these videos up there and like, oh my gosh, China is chaos. Those are such, way off the bell curve, like statistical anomalies that it doesn't represent life in China. I could literally walk around with a big like pile of cash in my house or in my neighborhood and just walk around for hours and hours in the middle of the night, and no one would even. People might be like, what's wrong with that guy? But like, no one's going to try to take it. And women are safe. I know lots of foreign women who live here, and they're like, this is the safest place I've ever lived in. By the way, I want to say that South Korea is pretty safe too. Japan is pretty safe too. I'm not saying that China is uniquely safe, but China is, compared to the United States, which was your question. Oh my gosh. I think statistically, I looked it up on Our World and Data. You have something like 16, it's 16 more times likely to be in a violent criminal attack in the United States as you are in China. But I think it feels like even less than that. Like, I've never in my roughly 12 years here in China encountered a crime or no one's ever attempted to rob me. No one's ever attempted to scam me. Let me compare that with my life in the United States. I had a car stolen. I had another car which I tried to sell, and the person didn't pay me, so that's like another car stolen. I was robbed at gunpoint by 3 children. When I say children, they were like 12. I had a car stereo stolen out of another car. I had a bass amp stolen. So like, I was constantly inundated with crime periodically in my life in the United States, my 30 something years in the United States. But nothing like that has ever happened to me in China, and nor would I expect it to. I like to get my 10,000 steps a day. I'm a big guy, so I'm probably not like the ideal person to say like I feel safe in the streets, because probably criminals would choose a easier target. But I definitely don't even look over my shoulder. And no one ever. I don't even see people around like kind of looking mischievous. You don't see that at all. And like, I think a large part of that, another part of what you asked about was poverty alleviation. Is there poverty in China? Yes. Now, when I say that, there was a poverty alleviation campaign that largely reached its target in 2020 to reach World Bank standards for eliminating absolute poverty. So absolute poverty is less than, I think, $3 a day. It was $2.91 a day when they achieved it, something like that. Now, China, it completely erased people who made less than that or had less than that access to food and water and stuff. So is there absolute poverty in China? No. But are there people who are not doing as well as the rest of people who may need help from the government? Or yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I went to Xinjiang. I was in the south of Xinjiang in a county called Pishan County as a journalist with a bunch of journalists. And I was brought to a community with thousands of homes. Now, these homes were given to impoverished people to help finish raising the last people out of poverty. Now, some of the homes in other places that I know about in Gansu and other places, some people had to pay like 10,000 RMB, which is like $1,500 to buy that home. Can you imagine? Oh my gosh, I almost want to be poor just so I could buy one. But in this case, in Pishan County, how they were raising people out of absolute poverty was China had made a list over a period of a couple of decades of all of the people living in impoverished conditions. So we're talking about people who have been living in the desert for generations, centuries, families that have been living in the desert for centuries without adequate access to food and water. And then they just went out there and said, hey, do you want a free apartment? And of course, most people were like, of course I do. So they moved them into this community that I was talking about. The community had free apartments with 2-bedroom houses, kitchen, came with washer, dryer, all that. It's a washing machine. They hang their clothes, but it came with, there's a community there, community center there for teaching technical skills. Every household gets its own greenhouse. And when I mean greenhouse, it's like 3 times the size of my apartment, which is like a greenhouse. They can grow for, self-sustenance, or they can bring it to the market. And there were technical experts there to help them grow different kinds of crops. If they wanted to do that, it was their choice what they did with their greenhouse. There was also a free school there. There was a free hospital there. So this is the kind of project that China set up all over the place in order to facilitate taking these extreme cases. And a lot of people have heard that China moved entire villages. So there were, for example, villages on mountaintops that you could only get to by climbing stairs for a couple of hours. So China went down into the valleys, built out communities and said, hey, would you like to come move down here? And so one of the things that I saw in 2012, 2013, 2014 was the occasional homeless person here in Beijing, beggars. But you don't see that anymore. Now, there are extreme cases, very seldom, where there's someone begging, but it is so considerably down. So when you ask about the previous question, like criminality, why would people be criminal when their needs are met? And that's what's not happening in the United States, where we have officially 650,000 homeless people, but really people think it's closer to 2 million. And so, yeah, there are people who are completely impoverished, who are desperate. What are they going to do? Some of those people are going to do drugs, are going to turn to criminality, are going to try to rob you in the street. So China has essentially eliminated, the potential for people to need to be criminal. And I think that's something that the United States could learn from. Does the United States have low-income housing? Yes. Does it have enough? Clearly not. Does China have enough? Clearly. So those are significant differences in terms of poverty and terms of criminality. So I think those are 2 parts of your question. Your question was quite long. I'm not sure if I answered all of it.
It was good enough, as a good answer. Sorry about that. I get a bit nervous in my in the beginning of the show, and then I get better later on. But
wait,
Jason,
I think I remember. You were asking about people's needs being met by the government when they have a complaint.
Yeah. Like,
let me answer that in a couple different ways. Firstly, if I want to, here's my Xiaomi phone. I can dial 12345 right now, and I can complain about anything. Now, my Chinese is just okay, so they'll probably be like, can you get someone else to help? But, a Chinese person can call 12345 and they can complain about a great many things. Oh, the grocer near my house is overcharging for something, or there's a tree blocking my view, or my neighbor is annoying, or you know what? I don't like the fact that there are bicycles riding on this sidewalk over here, or whatever it is, or like the subway didn't run on time by 2 minutes. They can call and they can complain about anything. And there are a lot of people who have made videos from the call centers in different cities in China to demonstrate this. Now, local officials will snap to literally and try to find solutions to that problem. They'll send people out. Okay, get the 2 neighbors together. You play your music too loud, or you planted a tree here that shouldn't, blocks your neighbor's view. Let's see if we can come to an accommodation. But in terms of a national scale, now, China does have elections at a local level to elect its local officials. And then a lot of those officials elect people above them and eventually get to the NPC, the National People's Congress. And then you have the CPPCC, which is a consultative body. They meet every year. Firstly, NPC meets all year. They're the highest lawmaking body in China. It's like Congress, kind of, in the United States. And I guess the CPPCC could be kind of equated to the House of Representatives, but only meets once a year in what is known as 2 sessions. Now, the two bodies exist in different ways. The NPC is fully elected, and the CPPCC is a lot of people that just want to make sure that every class of person is represented. Now, in the United States, we have a vast majority of our representatives are lawyers. But in China, that's not even close to the case. They have a very broad spectrum of farmers, workers, technicians, miners, teachers. They have a couple of actors. You hear about them very commonly because it's such so and such famous actor. They have, every kind IT people, every kind of person, and they have every ethnicity or minority, they call them in China. There are 56 ethnic groups in China, 55 of which are minorities. So you've probably heard a lot about them. There's the Hui, there's the Uyghur, there's all kinds, all from all over the place. Every one of these groups is represented, not just one people, but several people, especially depending on the larger size of the ethnic group as a percentage of the population. There are more of them. There are old people, there are young people, there are women, there are men. So all of these voices get together, both in the NPC and the CPPCC, and they get together at least in 2 sessions, and the CPPCC basically complains. That's their job. These are the things we need to fix. This is the economic problem. People are not getting their residence here or their housing, or there's some problem with this computer system, or why don't we spend more money on this, or could we pass a law to change that? And then the NPC listens to all of the ideas of the CPPCC and decides, how to balance those with a 1-year plan. So that there are different 5-year plans, 10-year plans. And then there's 1-year plans that the 2 sessions have each year. Now, all of the plans fit within the other plans. So the NPC will think, okay, here are all the things that the CPPCC wants and what we want, and how we want to proceed to make China better over the course of the next year. Here are the 5-year plans. How can we make those fit inside of them, right, for economic outcomes and better prosperity and such? So one of the plans right now up to 2035 is called the Common Prosperity Plan, to raise all people to kind of like a level of sort of middle class. That's the best way to describe it. There's a technical term for it, but they fit all of these plans together, and then they pass those laws over the course of the year and make changes in China that benefit the people. So that is a vehicle. And if I was a Chinese person, there would be a local CPPCC member or a local NPC office that I could walk into, and I could say right there in the office, there's not one body. It's not just in Congress where you have to go to Washington to complain. Your local official representative is nearby, and you can go into their office and complain. Hey, this is happening. Workers at this company are not being paid what they're supposed to be paid, or they're not implementing this law. You need to make sure that companies are held responsible for this kind of thing. And so these people, when they're having these consultations, they will create laws and tools to make sure that those laws are implemented to meet the needs of the people. So kind of all of the voices of China are complaining literally to these people and offering suggestions, and then these people get together and make a lot of decisions on how to implement those. And this consultative whole people's process democracy, as it's called, is working, because it's not just the Harvard study that showed at different points it was like 95% approval of Beijing's government, but there were other studies done too by like Latana and other institutions that show that China's government has the highest approval rating of most any government in the world. And the United States typically gets around 39%. That was its pass in one of these studies. And China gets between 80 to 95%, depending on the study. Where people are surveyed, they're like generally happy. Of course, you're going to find people who are not happy. So you can see people, maybe migrating to the United States, and so, oh my gosh, thousands of people China is a country of 1.4 billion people. Of course, there are going to be outliers where some people are like, I think I can have a better life over there. And maybe part of that's true. Maybe it's part of propaganda from the United States saying that the streets are made of gold, which everyone knows is not true. But, I think based on my interactions with normal people over the course of 12 years, and I know, I've known thousands of Chinese people here, most people are, in fact, legitimately not just happy, but proud of China and China's system.
Jason, I saw in one of your latest YouTube videos that you went to the CCP museum. That must have been absolutely awesome to go to. And when you went to that museum, knowing from what people say about the CCP, like a lot of pro-China people say the CCP like lifting so many people out of poverty and like doing the accomplishments where pretty much in the last 60 years taking China from a third world dump to potentially the world's superpower soon, which is going to become. When you look at the CCP yourself and when you went to that museum, what is your favorite thing about the CCP story? And what would you say like is your favorite thing about how like the funding of the CCP came to be, and what was your favorite piece of like architecture or writing that you saw in the museum when you went there to visit it?
Well, firstly, I want to put that in context why I went to that museum. I am a museum nerd. I'm a science nerd, a museum nerd, a history nerd. So my wife and I, a few years ago in Beijing, were trying to see every museum in Beijing. Eventually we quit. People don't know this. Even people, foreigners who've lived here, even many Chinese Beijingers don't know this. But one of the monikers that's most commonly used to describe Beijing is Beijing, City of Museums. And there are well more than 200 or 300 museums. So my wife and I, we went to like 50, and then we were like, okay, largely let's just give up. If we find a museum, sometimes we'll go, but we're not going to try this like go to every museum thing anymore. It was just there were too many museums to see. But I was out with one of my friends from America, a PhD from UC Berkeley. He had come over with one of his students from Vassar College, and they were doing a tour of China. So I was out walking with him, and we both saw this museum, which was the history of the Chinese, the Communist Party of China. So I was like, wow, this looks great. I didn't know this existed. And it was such a mammoth museum that I was really surprised. I felt almost ashamed that I hadn't found it. Then I later found out it's only been there for 2 or 3 years. So I was like, oh, okay. So that's all right. But I went in, and in terms of your question, what am I most in admiration of? Well, I think the people who criticize China oftentimes have the same values that people who like China have. And I think this is confusing. People who criticize China oftentimes want people to have human rights, and they're just wrong about Chinese people not having human rights. So what do I want? For humanity, I want people to be able to feed their family, to be able to get a good education, to be able to have access to water and food and, rest and good working hours. I think that's what most sane people everywhere all over the world want. So what I like about the Communist Party of China is that they have provided that largely, but not just in China. The Belt and Road Initiative is actually exporting a lot of the techniques that China has used in poverty alleviation. There's a lot of aid. Actually, I have a book right here behind me. Sorry, this side, the mirror of the camera, which talks about Chinese foreign aid. And it's not just this book that I quote all over the place. I go to like other resources as well. The Carey Institute and Johns Hopkins University has some great resources as well about Chinese projects done abroad where they build hospitals. And I'm not talking they built a hospital for Nigeria once. No, we're talking about hundreds of hospitals and thousands of schools and dozens of hydroelectric power plants, which provide almost endless renewable clean energy for decades at least, and then they can be refitted and re-outfitted later. So these countries, which were not developing on their own or with help from World Bank for reasons I don't want to entirely go into because it would take a long time to explain, but China's Exim Bank and AIIB and financing from even individual banks offer these very low loans and sometimes just paid for them for free. A lot of the hospitals, a lot of the schools were gifts. they're called friendship hospitals or friendship schools, friendship bridges. And then there were a lot of ports that China built around. So how did China develop? It developed by, there's this phrase in China, if you want to become rich, build a road. So China is literally building roads all over the world, ports, airports, seaports, high-speed rail in Africa, for very low interest loans, and sometimes a lot of it is free, where China is actually literally giving aid. It's different from the kind of aid that came from the West. I do want to talk about World Bank really quickly. World Bank does this thing where they have something that is sometimes called the Washington Consensus. Some people think that term is a good term. Some people think that term is a bad term. But what they do is they force the country to liberalize certain parts of their economy in exchange for loans. So this will mean like, okay, you can build, we'll help you build this bridge, but then you have to sell us this forest that is a national forest. And so then the country agrees to that, and then they get the first part of the loan to start the bridge. Then the bridge is partially built, and they need the second tranche, the second investment from World Bank or IMF. And then they say, oh, okay, now you need to make these banks international banks. They can no longer be controlled by your state. You need to sell them to, privatize them immediately. So they have this process in the Washington Consensus of privatizing everything in that country, and it essentially allows rich investors from Western countries, from advanced countries, to come in and buy up all of their resources. And so China's loans, which most often are about 2%, they're called concessional loans. Sometimes you'll find one that's a higher percentage, like 5%. But usually they're 0% or 2%, sometimes with small caveats. But they do not force the countries that are receiving these investments to change their internal economic plans, to privatize anything or to sell anything to Chinese companies or to sell anything to the highest international bidder. China has a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. So they have a government that is right-wing, government left-wing. China's interest is, we want to help you develop. If you want to work with us, if you want to be in the Belt and Road Initiative, if you want to be a part of one of our schemes to build hospitals for free, you can. Whatever kind of government you have, China is there to help develop members of the Belt and Road who are willing to adopt certain international logistics protocols, like let's try to have this kind of more free trade, or let's have rails that with certain gauges so that we can ship things from China to Europe, or from parts of the Middle East up into Europe, or whatever, so that increase global trade to allow these smaller developing countries to take their goods to markets where they can potentially sell their goods for much higher value. Let's say you're Ghana and you're selling cocoa beans. If you can only sell to your neighbors because the logistics only allow you to do that, you're only going to be able to sell your cocoa for a certain value. But if suddenly you have a port and you can sell cocoa anywhere in the world, you're obviously going to get a lot more money for your cocoa. So your economy improves, and this creates jobs. When China helps build a electric power dam, it's not just electricity. That is the electricity needed for industrialization. And it is also, becomes a tourist attraction. Some of these countries that have got these dams that China has built, they put the dams on their money because they're so incredibly proud. Imagine in America, they have the Hoover Dam. How many people go visit the Hoover Dam? It creates a local economy around that dam where people go to see it.
A lot of people do.
Yeah. So these projects, they often become like sightseeing exhibitions for locals, in addition to the fact that now people can control the water flow. Maybe before the dam, it just flooded sometimes. Now they can tell farmers, these are when the times we're planning on trying to release the water. So these kinds of crops make the most sense. So now you have higher yields. So you asked me, your question is, what do I like most about the CPC? That's the first part of your question. I like that it has raised people's living standards in China, and now it is trying to also raise the living standards of people around the world who are willing to work with China to do that. In the museum, what did I like the most? I thought it was really fascinating that, you see the processions, like parades here in China, where different chairmen and presidents, they ride in those very fancy cars with the microphones down Chang'an Avenue. They had all of those cars in the museum, dating back to Mao all the way to President Xi Jinping. They had those cars in the museum. And I think they should actually be a little further. There was red line, but you got close enough where you could just like touch the car. So maybe in the future they'll put some guardrails around it. But it was an amazing museum, several floors tall, and it spelled out the kind of the history of China since 1949, but also the history of the party. It was a great museum.
Jason, when you were mentioning that book right now,
Mm-hmm.
China Foreign Aid, when you were
Mm-hmm.
reading that book and
Mm-hmm.
also like about the Belt and Road Initiative, what
Mm-hmm.
would you say was your favorite moment from that book? Like what your favorite like story of China giving aid to any country from what you've read, like out of anything that China's done when giving to foreign aid, like your favorite story about China giving aid to a country, what would you say? And what would you say is like your favorite story that China has done to help other nations? Like favorite moment from like whether you heard from an interview from a foreigner where China has helped other countries out with the Belt and Road Initiative when it comes to helping poor countries.
But you also know the journalist Li Jingjing. It's not from this book. It's from one of Li Jingjing's interviews. She was speaking with someone from an African country. She was interviewing this lady, and this lady was complaining that the United States had sent, I think it was Victoria Nuland or something, to come and say, "Hey, you have to choose the United States or China." And this woman, she described, you know, the ambassador, the secretary or the member of the U.S. State Department who had come to visit them, had landed in an airport built by China, taken a road built by China, come to a conference center built by China to tell them, don't be friends with China. And obviously these folks thought that was ridiculous. And so, like, these countries, they're mature, they're their own nations, they're sovereign. They don't want to choose. They want to have partnerships with the United States. They want to have partnerships with China. China wants to have partnerships with the United States. China is eager to be open for business, for investing in the United States and having US investors in itself. And so are all these other countries. If you are a developing country, you don't want one of the big powers in the world to tell you you can't be friends with another big power. The best way for your economy to develop is to trade with everyone. And so the United States is not projecting a good look among developing countries when the United States tries to dictate to those countries who they can and cannot trade with. So, that's one of my favorite stories from an interview by Li Jingjing. But I mean, I also noticed that there are different kinds of Chinese aid. So China also does the US style aid where it sends emergency aid, food aid, and water aid to countries right after massive earthquakes and volcanoes. And so there was one, I can't remember in Tonga, a volcano erupted just 2 or 3
Yeah.
years ago. It was devastating. And China sent 2 destroyers, but they were completely revamped to bring like lamps and water purification machines and tents and sleeping bags and water, because they had a big belly and they filled it with clean water. And then they went back to China, and then they got more goods and went back. So it's not just that. China, and this is really weird in the international context because you see what's going on with the Philippines and the South China Sea right now. But several bridges in the Philippines were built as gifts by China. And China also always sends aid to the Philippines when there is a tsunami or a hurricane. So I think that's really fascinating. You see these, like countries like the Philippines, like saying, "Oh, I like you more now, the United States. Oh, but now I like you more, China." And I think it's to their benefit because they're like playing their 2 big brothers against each other. But, China doesn't just help those countries that are like, "I love China." It helps those countries that are like willing to participate. And currently, the Philippines, for example, is a member of the Belt and Road Initiative. So all the countries that are members of the Belt and Road Initiative, they have access to Chinese technology, Chinese scientists. China sends agronomists to countries to test the soil. And then they say, you're growing this right now. You might want to grow these things instead because they probably would grow better in this climate. And so a lot of countries gain that kind of expertise from Chinese scientists who are willing to go to all parts of the world and help developing countries have better economic outcomes for their people. I mean, in the United States, and philanthropists from the West, from Europe, they help build wells in developing country, and so does China. It's not too dissimilar. But what is dissimilar is that China's financing is considerably more favorable to developing countries. And if you're a developing country, you want to have your choice. You want to say, hey, World Bank, AIIB offered me this deal. Can you match that? And then if it's yes or no, then they have their option. I think that gives these countries more room to choose for themselves who they want to partner with. And it's clear 154 Belt and Road members are sometimes at least choosing China for their development projects. So China is an incredibly powerful resource for making our world better. I think anyone listening to this, whether they hate China or love China, they want a world where no one is starving to death, if they're a sane person. That is what China is trying to also accomplish. I mean, China is not just doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They have something called win-win diplomacy. So let's talk about Ghana again. Ghana, there was a dam that China built in Ghana, and Ghana they weren't cash flush. They're a relatively impoverished country, a developing country. And so Ghana literally traded in the same value of cocoa to pay for the dam. That's win-win. Chinese companies get cocoa at a great price. Ghana gets a dam that helps develop their infrastructure and create a more prosperous Ghana in the future. So China and that country win. The difference between China's aid that I like and World Bank and IMF is World Bank and IMF end up sometimes destroying the countries that they're working with by liberalizing their economies, because they have a one-size-fits-all plan for their economies that doesn't always fit in the best interest of those economies. Whereas China's like, let's just build this bridge. We don't want your forest or whatever. Maybe a Chinese company did buy forest from another company, and they are in fact planning on using that bridge to export some of those raw materials. But that had nothing to do with the bridge. The bridge's financing was not dependent upon this other business transaction. So I think China is offering more loans that are easier to get, that are better for recipient countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is very, very true what China's achieved with the Belt and Road Initiative. It is amazing. So, Jason, talking about that, as we all know, the United States Congress, of course, the Senate and the House, has voted to ban TikTok because they say, TikTok is violating American rights and China's using it to spy on Americans, when in fact they ignore the fact that all their phones come from China. All things mostly are made in China nowadays. I saw a funny meme, by the way, which, I'll tell you one thing. Before I ask this question, Jason, I saw a very funny meme of this Trump supporter saying, banning TikTok is great. And then the meme basically shows everything else is from China. It's a pretty funny meme. I'll send it to you a bit later. But yeah, going back to that. So, of course, the United States government has banned TikTok, right? And they accuse TikTok of spying on United States citizens. But at the same time, it's very hypocritical for the United States to do that because, Facebook, Twitter, and especially, the Patriot Act and the NSA, how they spy on citizens and how they've been doing it for years unconstitutionally, and how, the Congress in the United States just passed a bill where, they can do they can somehow hack your, I can't remember what it was, but it was the Spy Act or something like that. So, Jason, when you see that, right, what things do you think people know about the truth about the TikTok ban? What do you think facts people should know the truth about the TikTok ban, the hypocrisy, and how do you see things going with it forward, knowing the United States government is becoming more fascist? And what social media do you think they will ban next? And what does this mean for freedom of speech in America going forward?
Well, that's a very complicated question. So let me just see what I can, what makes sense within that context. TikTok is an amazing tool especially for young people. And a lot of them have work and jobs. I think, whatever we think about whichever governments are doing whatever, trying to copy each other's information or something. Firstly, I don't think that's true, because TikTok's information is stored on servers in Texas. It's not, and the Singaporean CEO is not exporting that information. And, obviously we all know that Facebook and all these other tools are used to monitor us. So I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think it probably has more to do with the fact that TikTok is wildly successful and US investors probably want to buy it. So what's going to happen in 9 months when this time runs out? I have no idea. It's really interesting to see what the outcome will be. But I think there's a couple deeper things going on. One is a lot of Americans, I think it's 148 million Americans, use TikTok regularly. And so a lot of those people make money. They advertise their cafe or their personal service, or they're a young influencer. And this is going to hurt the US economy. That's going to be one thing. As an American, I don't want to see the US economy hurt. I don't want to see Americans hurt by what Congress is doing to them, by what the US elected leaders are doing to their, the people who elected them. So I think there's an underestimation, firstly, about these elected leaders, what the reaction is going to be in 9 months from the people, because the United States population is roughly 335 million people, and 150 million of them, roughly half of them, use TikTok regularly. And these are the youngest people and the people who, are expected to make the decisions for the country moving forward. Gen Z is going to be more influential, and they're one of the most educated generations for their age. So what's this going to do to the American people when they realize their leaders are willing to take away their most favored, social media tool? I think our elected leaders in the United States have underestimated what that is going to mean for the American discourse. So what are we talking about? Stealing freedom, or people realizing their freedom is being stolen? I think that is a much larger concern. But I mean, there's another secondary thing beyond the people who are going to be outraged that this is happening. I think there's another component to this. And, it is about the United States cutting itself off from the rest of the world. The United States has tried for the last 5 or 6, 7 years to increasingly de-risk from certain countries, not just China, but several other countries. The United States has more sanctions on other countries than any other country in the world. In fact, if you probably combined all the sanctions all other countries have in the world on other countries, it would be less than what the United States has. The United States also seizes assets from other countries, from Afghanistan, $9 billion when they were leaving. We stole $9 billion from the Afghan people, one of the poorest people in the world. They needed that money to develop, and we took it with us. And then the United States froze all of Russia's assets that were in the United States, that in Western countries. And now the United States is going to steal a Chinese company. Now, if you put all of this together and just don't look at the individual reasons for any one of them, if you are an investor in any country in the world and you're looking at the United States, you might start to be afraid. Should I buy treasuries? The United States might just freeze them and steal them from me. Should I put FDI into their banks? Maybe not, because they might just steal that from me. Should I take this amazing company and also, integrate it into the United States? Maybe not, because the United States might freeze that or steal that company from me. And the United States does this, with Huawei and with other companies as well, where they've completely shut down huge, massive projects that were multi-billion-dollar projects in the United States, and billions of dollars in money invested in treasuries. The United States is essentially proving to the broader world that investments into the United States are potentially very risky and maybe a mistake. So if you're an investor in Spain, you might be looking at a different country. You might be like, well, maybe I can invest in China. Maybe I can invest in Japan. Maybe I can invest in the UK while its economy is down, and gets a good deal as it's potentially rising up in a few years. So the United States is damaging its own image as a place to do business. In the 1990s, the United States was like, we are the free trade kings. We're the kings of free trade. We want to trade with everyone invest in everywhere. They were doing this whole globalization thing. You never stopped hearing the word globalization in the 1990s. But now the United States is anti-investment, and they're investing in the United States is potentially extremely dangerous. So what do I think about Congress seizing TikTok, a foreign asset, and trying to force it to be sold to American investors, I think the United States is going to do a lot more damage to itself than to any other country. A lot of the plans that some of the leaders in the White House, for example, Gina Raimondo, are using to try to hurt China only hurt the United States. Let's just talk about semiconductors. So they're like, oh, China, you can't buy these kinds of semiconductors. Okay, you know, China is the largest consumer of semiconductors in the world by far because it makes radios and televisions and all these things that are purchased all over the world. So if China can't buy those semiconductors from the US and its allies, it's gonna make them at home. What does that mean? That means in 5 years, China won't need the United States or its allies to buy semiconductors from. And China will be making the best semiconductors in the world. And that will just be a process that continues where China takes over the semiconductor business. So these plans to like, oh, we'll just hurt China a little bit are backfiring one after another. They're hurting the US image and they're hurting US technology. I mean, we saw with the anti-Asian hate crime increase from 2020, 2021, 2022. These are well documented on, you know, like the FBI's website that these crimes were increasing by like 300% per year. A lot of Chinese scientists just left. And also the FBI was investigating scientists who were just there to do science. And then they're like, whoa, this is weird. You know, people are investigating me. I lost my job. They're migrating back to China in larger numbers than ever before. So the United States just keeps shooting itself in the foot over and over and over on China. When in fact, you know, we're talking about TikTok, the United States should be embracing China as a partner to do business with, because that makes much more sense for the United States, because the government of the United States is supposed to look out for primarily for the interests of the people of the United States. Whatever it does beyond that in terms of aid or helping other countries or whatever any country does, that's, you know, a bonus, but they should be watching out for their own people's best interest. And clearly, all of these crazy attacks on China and other countries around the world are not really hurting China or these other countries. Look at Russia's GDP is growing faster than most European countries right now. The plans that the United States is hatching to hurt other countries just end up hurting the US and its allies. And I really don't have, because of this keeps happening, I don't have faith in our leaders in the United States because they're clearly not able to deliver the best in what's in the best interest of American people.
So, Jason, before we finish up, one last thing. How do you see the future? Like I say, one last question. How do you see the future of the United States? Do you think America will turn itself around? And also, how do you see China and Taiwan? Do you think there's going to be a conflict between China and Taiwan, or do you think Taiwan will go back to China peacefully? And how do you see the future for the rest of the world going forward? Do you think it will be good, or do you think there'll be a rough patch before it gets better?
It's a very complicated question. And I don't like to take very long-term kind of looks into the future because they're almost always inaccurate. There are a lot of famous predictions we could talk about. But in terms of, let's just take Taiwan first. I think there will be an incredible economic incentive for the people of Taiwan to reintegrate with China's mainland in a peaceful way in the next 10 years. And why I say that is because there are a lot of people who think China's economy is not doing well. I would say they have no idea what they're talking about. There's a larger context. Look at the GDP growth of China, 5.2% in 2023. That is the growth rate of China in last year. It's probably going to be close to 5.1% this year again. The US GDP growth rate last year was 2.5, which was outstanding for the United States, highest in the G7. And Yellen, you know, Secretary Yellen was like, yay, America, we're the winners. Really? Well, China's economy grew at more than twice as fast the speed as the United States. And that makes sense because developing countries typically grow slower than developing countries. And China is still a developing country. But China's economy isn't slowing down. It's, you know, it's still adding $1 trillion value every single year over and over and over again. So that percentage sometimes goes down a little bit because China's economy has just become so massive. And obviously, a lot of people don't like purchasing power parity because it proves them wrong. But China's economy is already larger than the United States by purchasing power parity. By nominal terms, China's economy is almost as big as that of the United States. And it is set to keep growing for a long time. And the reason I say that is China has more than half of all robotics. And we're talking about manufacturing robotics, not, you know, the toy ones you see in the mall or in the hotel, which are cute. But, you know, manufacturing robotics. For example, the Xiaomi factory is completely 100% automated now. 100% automated. So what's going to happen when labor goes up in value? Well, it's not going to impact manufacturing in China because China is doing two things. One of those is increasing the robotics in factories to take some of the humans out of that process. And number two, it is inshoring to Western China, to places like Gansu, where there is still opportunity for economic development for the people of Gansu because their GDP is lower than other provinces of China. So who's the next China? China's the next China. I want to emphasize that. China is the next China. Who's going to be, the dominating economic power in the world in the next 10 years in terms of growth and the growth engine that is adding to global growth? It's still going to be China. India's doing great. Yes. Indonesia's doing phenomenally well. But China is already at a level where if it just keeps adding roughly 5% for 10 years, that is just mammoth. That is outstandingly mammoth. So we're talking about Taiwan. Taiwan is going to be like, wow, look at that opportunity. And you already have university students from Taiwan who are studying in China's mainland at prestigious universities here. China has some of the best technical and scientific universities on the planet, bar none. So Taiwan students from Taiwan are already studying in China's mainland. Now, they're all also doing business in China's mainland. A lot of the rich people in Taiwan, they have factories in China's mainland. So it is incumbent. It makes sense for Taiwan to look for ways of integrating, to say, well, this is the blueprint for us being more of a one China sort of framework. There's no need for conflict. The United States likes to they have their certain people, I know their names, who like to say there's a big conflict. China's going to invade any moment. We should buy more weapons. You should buy some more F-16s. That is just the United States trying to sell weapons, the United States trying to foment conflict, and the United States thinking that for most of Taiwan can be like an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States in its island chain defense system, which just means the United States is trying to surround China. But this is actually insane, and it doesn't make sense for the people of Taiwan. And I think that more and more people in the future are going to be looking at how huge China's economy is and going to want to reintegrate with that. And what is going to happen to the United States? I have no idea. It could go so many different directions. The United States is so messy. The internal politics of the United States are extremely complicated, extremely messy. And I think anyone who thinks they know what's going to happen has no idea. Well, going back to the TikTok ban, that's going to create an enormous change in the political sentiments of the youth. And I think we need to wait for that to see what's going to happen. I hope that the United States chooses a more peaceful path. I hope that the United States decide, we have a huge problem with debt. The financing of our debt. That means paying the interest on our existing debt is now larger than the U.S. spends on its defense. So that doesn't make any sense. So, and with the United States having the lower interest rates, they're not going to be able to sell treasuries as well once they do that. And if they don't do that, CPI is going to keep. So it's very complicated, but the economics of the dollar and the United States are not looking good in the next 5 years. And there is a potential the United States are going to have to make some tough decisions. The people of the United States are not going to let Social Security be cut. The people of the United States are not going to let other kinds of benefits be cut. So what does that mean? That means that the United States might have to consider closing some of its 851 foreign bases, its empire. I had a guest recently on my show recently said, and he's an American, the best thing for the United States is to, pack up the empire and invest in the republic. I don't think it makes sense to close all U.S. bases abroad, but most of them, yeah, we could save so much money and then start investing in our people. What people in the United States need: infrastructure, rail, education, healthcare. Those are the kinds of things that Americans want, and are spending our money on all of these foreign interventions all over the world is not in the best interest of the world or the American people. The American people would much rather have a better life for themselves and a better relationship with people around the world. But in terms of what is going to happen, no, I'm not sure. I don't think anyone knows.
Well, Jason, it was an absolute pleasure having you. Where can people find you, Jason?
Well, you can find me. I have the Bridge Podcast. If you type in the Bridge Podcast, Acorn Studio, you'll be able to find my podcast. You can also find me on X under my Chinese name, Shangguan Jie1. I have 25,000 followers. It won't be too hard. It'll pop up in Google pretty fast.
Well, it was a pleasure having you, Jason. It was a
Thank you, sir.
wonderful time. I really enjoyed this show. And I just want to say to everybody, please go and follow Jason on Twitter. Please go check out his podcast, The Bridge Podcast. He does absolutely fantastic discussions on China, international politics, United States politics. Follow his TikTok. He also does fantastic videos on exploring China, and you'll learn a lot from him. So, very talented guy. Go give him all the support and likes he deserves. And yeah, and also I just want to say to everybody, please remember to like and subscribe this video. Thank you for joining the Welsh Republic Podcast, episode 149. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Never give up. And bye.